Sarah, Sarah and Kevin and I were just chatting and let the time get away a little bit. But thank you again for joining. So a couple of what I'll call housekeeping items before we will have an opening prayer, and then I'll turn it over to Kevin. But housekeeping items are we're going to get a newsletter out soon, as in the next week or two, I hope. And we are going to announce that in addition to this series, we're going to be launching in the fall a weekly faith formation series led by a guy that I know who's very good, very passionate, and very grounded theologically. And so this will not be specifically around Augustinian spirituality. It will be around, the basics that every Catholic should know from Genesis through Acts of the Apostles. And so look for that. I expect we'll also be launching a weekly prayer group. So look for that. And then, we'll start to figure out what's in store for next year. We also have, I think, in the near term chapters, new on the ground chapters that we will launch in the Andover, Boston area, as well as in the South Philly area. So there's a lot going on. We continue to get interest from people from all over the country, all over the world, which is super. And so, if you guys are getting value from this, please feel free to share it, and please feel free to send in ideas and suggestions for things that would make all of us, a more robust community virtually. So with that, thank you again for joining. I'm going to ask everyone just to pause for a minute. I'm going to offer a quick prayer, and then I will turn it over to Kevin to take us through the session tonight. Dear God, thank you for this opportunity to come together. We pray in a special way for Pope Leo, all of our friars and brothers and religious sisters. We pray for those of us who are comforting people who are sick, and for those who have lost dear loved ones since the last time we have met, that they may be comforted in the knowledge that you know us all and love us all, and we then have the strength to carry on in your will. And we pray also that this time that we have together, right here, right now, is meaningful to us all spiritually, and that we're able to take that meaning and carry it out into our lives and interactions with others. Amen. So, Sarah, thanks as always for helping us to organize this. And Kevin, I will mute myself and turn it over to you. And thank you as always for leading us through this.
Great. Thanks as always. Okay, so here we are. We've made it to book 9, and the plan for tonight, per usual, is to spend just a couple of minutes on the structure of book 9, which is to say, how does it relate to the rest of Confessions, and then just a moment to say, okay, well, how is book 9 itself internally organized? For tonight, these remarks are going to be rather brief for a couple of reasons. One, the structure of book 9 is pretty straightforward, and I think we'll get this pretty quickly if you haven't already just from the reading. And secondly, book 9 is just absolutely jam-packed with so much interesting stuff that we really do have to keep moving, and I'm going to try to keep this moving at a pretty brisk pace. In fact, I have so many pictures to share. When I go to share my screen with the pictures, I'm probably just going to stay there because there are so many, and sometimes it's cumbersome going back and forth. You'll see this when we get there. So yeah, tons of interesting stuff happening in book 9. And as we've learned together, every book of the Confessions has these Easter eggs in them. And I think book 9 is a lot of fun because it's like doubly so. And they're really fun to find. And I'll point these out as we get into them. The interest in book 9 is partly attributable to the fact that there are so many references in book 9 to people and places that are easily accessible to us today. Book 9 basically supplies the itinerary for an Augustinian pilgrimage. And in fact, people do this. If you Google this, You will not have any difficulty finding groups that are taking tours of Italy and hitting all of the points that are in book 9. So we'll touch on these, make our own, I guess, mini pilgrimage through these as we get into it. So with that said, let's spend a couple minutes on structure before we get into the crux of the matter here. On listening again and rereading book 9, I think this time around the thing that struck me the most keenly is that book 9 relates to the rest of Confessions as the epilogue to the first 8 books. And that really is the key word for what's going on in book 9. It is the epilogue. And this is chiefly evident from the fact that Augustine is going to report the deaths of a number of people within his own inner circle. And I'm not contemplating Monica here, but he's going to mention people, most of whom had died in that interim 10-year period between books 9 and 10. And that gives the feeling of an epilogue. So this is going to include, in order, Verecundus, Nebridius, both friends, part of the Milan circle, and of course his son, Adeodatus. Also, in terms of the structure of book 9, we see that there are these clearly identified aspirations from the first 8 books that are finally realized when we get to book 9. And so one of these would be baptism. You might remember from book 1, anybody recall book 1, Augustine's reflecting on when he was a child, he got really ill. Monica was about to just gather him up in her arms and take him to the church to be baptized. He got well, like almost instantaneously. His baptism was deferred. Augustine spends some time in book 1 reflecting on this. Why was my baptism deferred? Well, baptism was realized in book 9. At the end of book 6, you might remember we made a joke about this. Monica's planning a wedding. Augustine's planning a retreat. Augustine had in mind to do this philosophical community to kind of escape the world at the end of book 6. Well, this is realized when we get into book 9 at Cassicaecum. Okay, so that's how book 9 relates to the rest of Confessions. It's realization, it's epilogue. But what about internally? Well, internally, book 9 it's pretty simple. I mean, it neatly divides into 2 sections, with Augustine and company's baptism really at the center point of book 9. It actually drops almost exactly in the center of book 9. Because you're checking like references, this would be 9.6.14. It is the midpoint of book 9. So something else is going on internally, which is that as in book 6, which of course was all about Alypius, the dominant narrative of book 9 actually belongs to someone other than Augustine. This is very transparent in book 9. And someone who is actually omnipresent, even though they're not always explicitly mentioned. This is, of course, Monica. And this would be, in many senses, the appropriate title for book 9. Book 9 is Monica or Saint Monica. On this note, if we dig a little bit, we are going to see Monica's presence in some interesting ways, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So the structure of book 9, it's pretty straightforward. Part 1, Augustine's retirement and the retreat to this place called Cassicaecum, which we're going to talk about here in just a second. Baptism, pretty much right at the center of book 9, which is a very short description. And then Monica's story unfolds through the end of the book. Okay, but before we move on from structure, there's actually this huge Easter egg in the structure of book 9 and how it relates to book 8. And I want to just point this out real quick before we move on. So everybody's familiar with this. We've talked about it repeatedly. Augustine uses the stages of life to build out the narrative of the Confessions, right? You got infancy, he's an enfance, literally means he can't speak. Then he's a puer, he's a little boy, and then he's an adolescent, and he's a man. He works through this. The structures should be clear to all of us by this point in time. Well, Augustine is going to use these stages of life in a really interesting way to illustrate the great reversal of the new birth. So consider this, connecting 8 to 9. So book 8 in the Garden of Milan, he represents himself. There's a section there where he represents himself, I'm using modern terminology, but as spastic nonverbal, like as an infant, in the agony of the new birth. And so we see this. Other people have picked up on this, and they're just making this up. Augustine, at the end of book 8, in the Garden of Milan, is living out the enfance. He's unable to speak. He's unable to say anything intelligible in the agony of the moment of conversion and the new birth. But then we get to the opening of book 9, and he makes this remarkable statement. This is not as transparent in English, but it's the first chapter of book 9. Embedded in some other things, he says, "And now I was talking with you." And so we read this in English and we think, okay, well, Augustine's talking with God. That's unremarkable. That's the whole of Confessions. But here's the thing: there's something happening in the Latin that helps us immediately, because the Latin is et gaudiebam tibi, which probably doesn't mean anything to anyone except that gaudiebam is not the word for talking; it's the word for chattering. It's what a child does. This is not what an adult does. Gaudiebam it's chatter. So he's an enfans in the garden at the beginning of book 9. I feel like the translators definitely missed this, but they will just say, and I was talking with you, but that's not what he says. He says, I was chattering with you, like how a young child talks to a parent. So he's chattering to his parent. And then we get to Cassiciacum, which is where we're going immediately. Augustine gathers his friends around him and his family, and it's at Cassiciacum that we see very definitively he learns how to speak about God, and he learns how to speak to God intelligently. And so we have this new adolescence playing out. And so Augustine's learning a new language, he's learning to speak, and we're going to see that there's one book in particular that he picks up, that he learns a language that he's going to employ for the rest of his life. So there is this Easter egg here of structure. An enfans in Milan, someone who's engaged in Gaudiebam, I was chattering about, and then at Cassiciacum, everything levels up and there's an intelligent discussion, the first intelligent discussion about God. So with that, let's go ahead and transition then to Cassiciacum. We're going to actually spend a little bit more time here than I had originally envisioned, because frankly, I just find it really interesting. So hopefully you will as well. But Augustine says something at 9.2.3 as he's getting ready to make this retirement. He explains the spiritual impetus for the retreat going to Cassiciacum, which is about 30 kilometers to the north of Milan. It's not that far. But he says something important, which you'll see in just a moment. He says, you pierced my heart with the arrow of your love, and we carried about with us your words. Now, this is important because for whatever reason, I can't actually see myself on the screen. I'm concerned about that, but you all can no doubt, you can see the hat, right? You see the image on the hat. Well, this is the image of the Augustinian order. It's not accidental. There is the heart transfixed above an open book, which is, of course, the Bible, which is on fire, and we're going to get to that in a moment. But this symbolism, it comes from this verse. This is where it comes from. You pierced my heart with the arrow of your love. Well, there's the symbol. This is where we get this. Augustine is going to go on and further supply the circumstances of his resignation from the relatively important government post. We don't need to necessarily rehearse his reasoning here, the illness and so on. But what we really want to focus on are the three key aspects of what happens in Cassiciacum. What's the deal with him leaving during the holiday and spending 3-4 months in the shadow of the Alps, which most of us probably relish that opportunity. But what's he doing there? Well, there's three things that are going on in Cassiciacum that come out relatively clearly. And then there are some other things going on that are extremely important that maybe are not as on the surface. The first thing is that Augustine went on a retreat to learn how to speak about God and learn how to speak to God. Although, at this point in the Confessions, he does characterize this in an interesting way, and I wonder if you caught this. He describes these early works in Cassiciacum that he's writing, and he says, they still breathe the spirit of the school of pride, as if they were the last gasp. And so Augustine's going to qualify these first 4 or 5 things that he writes as still being a bit of an admixture. He is speaking intelligently, but it's still tinged with a certain pride. Incidentally, the other thing that Augustine will produce and write while he's at Cassiciacum are letters to his friend Nebridius, who, of course, we learn dies shortly thereafter. And we actually still have these. So if you're ever interested, I mean, this is an easy thing to find. Google search it. It's letters number 3 and 4 in our collection of Augustine's letters. We have the letters that Augustine references in Confessions that he sent to Nebridius, who could not be present, explaining what's going on at Cassiciacum. So that's number one. Augustine wants to go on this retreat to learn how to speak about and to God. And we're going to see how he works this out. Number two, Augustine went on retreat to be immersed in the Psalms. And there's another huge Easter egg here that we're going to get to a little bit further down the line. And number three, as Father Allen has pointed out in a very good article that he wrote a number of years ago, Augustine went on retreat to have his heart enlarged. So these are the three things. This is what's happening in Cassiciacum. He's learning how to speak about and to God. He's having an experience of immersion in the Psalms, one in particular that we'll see. As Father Allen has pointed out, Augustine goes on this retreat to have his heart enlarged, which I guess if you're in the business of planning spiritual retreats, this would not be a terrible way to try to frame it in. What do we want to do on this retreat? Well, we want to learn how to speak about and to God in an intelligent way. We want to be immersed in the Psalms, and we want to have our hearts enlarged. I mean, that sounds like a retreat that there would be some real interest in. And so with that, I'm going to transition here to sharing the screen, and in picture mode from here on out. Everybody able to see this comfortably? Looks good. Okay. So Cassiciacum, 30 kilometers, about 21 miles or so north of Milan, the foot of the Alps. This is actually a mural that is in modern Cassago Brianza, which most people believe this is the site for Cassiciacum. This is frankly not very good, in my opinion, but it does have some interesting elements to it. You will, of course, see Augustine is haloed. Monica is haloed. These two are not identified, but the kid to the left is obviously Adeodatus. So I think it's very tasteful. I mean, I think this captures it. Well, I don't find it aesthetically very pleasing, but I think the elements that are there are actually quite nice. So this is lovely in its own way. Okay, this is the part of the archaeological park at Cassago Brianza, which anyone is welcome to visit. This is actually a major destination for people doing like a walking in the footsteps of Augustine tour. They're going to take you a few places, all of which we're going to talk about in this session, but they will absolutely take you to Cassago Brianza. So this is believed, the evidence isn't fantastic, but there's not really a compelling alternative. The evidence is believed is that what you're looking at here in this picture is, generally speaking, the vicinity of where the rural estate was, where Augustine and family and friends had gathered for the post-conversion retreat at Cassiciacum. In that same archaeological park, someone has designed something that I do find is rather beautiful, which is a bronze of Augustine and Monica in discussion. It is, you've always got to think about how to interpret the things that we see artistically depicted. It is not incidental that Monica is standing and Augustine is sitting, and she appears to be giving the instruction. We're going to see why that is in just a moment. So I'll leave this image up and keep this as the background as we talk about Cassiciacum. So those 3 points, let me just flesh these out a little bit before we move on to what happens at Augustine's baptism. So the first thing that we said is Augustine goes to Cassiciacum, and while he's here, he learns how to speak about God and to God. You know, he levels up in this ability. When there's a particular way in which he does this, and it's that while Augustine is on retreat, he starts writing things that all of which we have today, which are the source of an astonishing amount of academic interest, because it's the first thing that he wrote after his conversion. And so these works that Augustine writes are all structured as dialogues. So, you know, like a Platonic dialogue. I don't know if anyone's read any of these, you know, but generally there's characters involved. There's some philosophical question put to the group, and the way that the discussion unfolds helps the reader kind of get to the right conclusion or understand the nature of the discussion. Augustine wouldn't have read this directly in Plato, but he would have seen this constantly in Cicero. The Hortensius, we talked about this if you remember earlier, the Hortensius was one of these dialogues. The purpose of the Hortensius was Cicero's trying to commend to people, look, you really want to live the philosophical life. This is the thing to shoot for. And the whole dialogue, these guys going back and forth, actually in a retreat area near the Alps, it's patterned on this, right? It's supposed to lead the reader to have this appreciation to say, oh, okay, now I understand, not because I read, you know, like this formal outline, but because I can understand the conversation. So anyway, Augustine writes these dialogues. They're all modeled after Cicero, and they all include his family and friends. These are the people that he has in the dialogue. So Augustine actually presents these as transcripts of the actual conversations that we're having, which is fascinating in its own right. So let me just tell you the 4 that he wrote. It's worth knowing this. So Augustine wrote something called the soliloquies, which that might be a word that you've heard if you've done Shakespearean studies or other things in theater. Soliloquy is a word that you know. Well, prior to Augustine, it's not a word you would have known because he invented the word. soliloquy it's solo or solus, and then loquor, which is to speak. So it's solo or solus, it's to speak alone. But in Augustine's context, which is what it is in Shakespeare, but in Augustine's context, it's to speak to himself. It's a soliloquy. He names the book what it is, using this word for the first time ever. The soliloquies that Augustine writes in Cassiciacum contain the germ of the confessions. Like, this is the starting point. This is Augustine in dialogue with himself, which makes him capable of making this confession and being in dialogue with God. It is a dialogue, but Augustine is the only person in the dialogue. It's him, basically in dialogue with his own reason. The signature passage in soliloquies, all that we care about for tonight is this. Augustine asks himself a question. He says, what is it that you really want? What is it that you really want? Which is a great philosophical starting point. What do you really want? And Augustine responds to himself or to his reason, and he says, what I want is to know myself and to know God. And his reason responds to him with a question and says, nothing more. And Augustine responds again, nothing more. So this is the key, this is the kernel of the soliloquies, which really does put us in contact with effectively the starting point of Augustinian spirituality. What is it that you want? I want to know myself and I want to know God. Is that all you want? That's all that I want. This gets us to the heart of it. Okay, so he writes this. Another thing that he writes is a book called The Happy Life. This should kind of resonate a little bit for us because that was the whole point of Hortensius. Where do you find the happy life? Cicero answered that by saying, by living a philosophical existence. And then Augustine writes a third book called On Order, which sounds kind of boring, but it actually tackles the problem of evil. And so some people call it divine providence, some people call it the problem of evil. But again, this should be familiar. This is book 7, right, of the Confessions. Augustine's tackling evil. As soon as he gets to Cassiciacum, what's he do? Writes a book on the problem of evil. And then he writes another book called Against the Academics, which deals with one of Cicero's texts, actually called The Academics. We mentioned briefly Augustine went through the skeptical phase. And so this really was kind of a mental splinter he had to pull out. So he writes Against the Academics to kind of purge himself of skepticism. So the family and friends are all involved in these dialogues. They're the people that are asking and answering questions, but something happens in all of these dialogues, except of course soliloquies, which is really especially important for our purposes tonight, which is there's one individual in each of these dialogues who tends to be the person who drives it to its conclusion, who kind of astonishes people with this person's level of insight, and becomes kind of the de facto leader, bringing them to the right conclusion. Who would you guess this is? You could unmute and say if you want, I don't mind, but it's Monica. For what we're looking at in front of us, this is not an accidental image. In the Cassiciacum dialogues, Monica is shockingly and consistently the untrained individual who leads the rest of the group to the correct philosophical conclusion. It's rather fascinating. Well, we could say a lot on this, but at a minimum, the extent to which Augustine lionizes Monica, obviously he does so in book 9, but actually it's even more dramatic, no pun intended, in the dialogues where he sets her up kind of as the character who is instructing everybody else. There's a great deal that could be said about Augustine's view of women, but let's just say this: nobody in antiquity wrote about their mom. Let's just get that out. Roman men did not write about their mothers. This is safe to say. And furthermore, nobody ever in Roman society would have represented their mother or a woman as the person who was leading them to a correct philosophical conclusion when this person was untrained, and the person telling the story is a professionally trained rhetorical genius. So the shift that's taking place here is dramatic to a point that we can tend to lose sight of it. Okay, so we've got that. We've got the dialogues working themselves out. Well, let's talk about the second thing. So the second thing that happens in Cassiciacum is Augustine is immersed in the Psalms. And I'm just going to read this quote from chapter 8 of book 9 in its entirety. It's about a paragraph. Augustine says this. He says, "My God, how I cried to you when I read the Psalms of David, songs of faith, utterances of devotion, which allow no pride of spirit to enter in. I was but a beginner in authentic love of you, a catechumen resting in a country villa with another catechumen, Alypius. My mother stayed close by us in the clothing of a woman, but with a virile faith, an older woman's serenity, a mother's love, and a Christian devotion. How I cried out to you in these psalms, how they kindled my love for you. I was fired by an enthusiasm to recite them, were it possible, to the entire world in protest against the pride of the human race. Yet they are being sung in all the world, and there is none who can hide himself from your heat, which is, of course, a quotation from the Psalms. Okay, so this removes any ambiguity about the role of the Psalms in the experience of Cassie Caker. But the other thing that I would point out, I don't know how we'll be able to see this, but again, on the hat, right? You've got the Bible, the transfixed heart, and it's on fire. And so all of this symbolism coming from the beginning of Book 9. I just think that's worth noting. But there's something else going on here. There's something else going on in this whole discussion of Cassie Caecum. So if you're thinking about this in terms of the sections of what you read, this would be 9.4.8 to 9.4.11. There's something else going on in relation to the Psalms in the way that Augustine describes the Cassie Caecum experience in the Confessions. As we've mentioned before, I'm sure you remember this, but Psalm quotes appear on basically every page of Confessions. And if you're reading Chadwick or you're reading Holding, or really any of the translations that have like parenthetical in-text citations, I mean, it's a bit of a game. Find a page that doesn't have a Psalm quote on it. It's kind of tricky. Most of them do. In fact, there's a whole field dedicated to this, which is just studying Augustine's use of the Psalms in his quotation in the Confessions. And we're going to resist the temptation to go down that path tonight, but simply say this. One of the most understudied aspects of Augustine's use of the Psalms and the Confessions is right here, where we're at in the midpoint of the Cassie Caecum retreat. And the way that Augustine sets up this first half of Book 9 in the Cassie Caecum retreat is he gives us his reasons for going, right? The Vincita holidays come about, he has his illness, they get there and they write the dialogues. And then the middle section, something happens that I'm going to explain. And then at the end, there's the miracle cure of the toothache. Everybody caught that, right? The miracle cure of the toothache. That's what ends the time in Cassie Caecum. But in the midpoint of his description of the retreat, something else is going on. We are actually sitting at the exact midpoint of the book of the Confessions of a whole. This section, 948, 9.4.11, is pretty much, by any measure, the exact midpoint of the 13 books of the Confessions, which I think, okay, well, that's interesting. It's curious, but what happens? Well, I'll tell you what happens. Augustine does something at the exact midpoint of the Confessions that he does not do anywhere else in dealing with the Psalms, and that's he quotes an entire psalm and he comments on it line by line. That's not what he does in the rest of Confessions. He just kind of chooses these sound bites from the Psalms, really, and works them into the narrative. But something different happens here. He goes through and he quotes a psalm line by line by line and basically gives an exposition of it. This is admittedly not at all obvious in an English translation. But the fact of the matter is, somebody has studied this and developed a structural outline of what happens in 948, 949, 9.4.10, 9.4.11. And it's, when you look at it, it's pretty obvious. He's starting at Psalm 4.2, Psalm 4.2. Psalm 4.1 is actually just, there's not actually anything there. It's just the name of the psalm in the Latin Bible. Psalm 4.2, Psalm 4.3.4, 4.3.4, 4.5, 4.6, 4.7, 4.7, 4.8, 4.9, 4.10. This is what's going on. Augustine is making his way. I wrote this, by the way. I didn't steal this from somebody else. This is something that I worked on. This is why it's special interest to me. But this is exactly what Augustine's doing. He's going through and he's basically giving an exposition of Psalm 4. It's a sermon. He's giving a sermon. And who's he preaching to? Well, he tells us. I mean, he says throughout this section, I wish that my former Manichae friends could hear me now. Did you catch this? There are a couple places in the Confessions where Augustine makes it clear that the friends and acquaintances that he had as Manichaees are the front in the front of his mind. And this is the key spot in the Confessions. He's going through Psalm 4. He's applying it to the Manichaees. He's applying it to his own life as a Manichae. And he's saying, here I am kind of preaching this sermon alone. And I wish that these guys could hear me. I wish that they could hear what I'm saying. That's In my mind, that's actually quite interesting on its own. This is the most remarkable use of the Psalms in the Confessions, but I would go a step further and say that something else is happening here. And it's this. We're all familiar with the Confessions. We kind of have the gist of how this book works now that we're into it. City of God was mentioned in an earlier conversation before we all got on this, but none of these are the longest or the most laborious works that Augustine produced. Augustine's exposition of the Psalms, it goes by various names: Narrations of the Psalms, Commentary on the Psalms, Exposition of the Psalms. This is the longest thing that he wrote by far, and it took him his entire life. I mean, he worked on this pretty much from Cassicaicum-ish until almost the time that he died. 6 volumes is what it takes in English to capture all of these. It's twice the length of City of God. This is far and away his largest work, the one that he apparently enjoyed the most, the one that he certainly invested the most in. And so an argument that I've made related to what's going on in Cassicaicum is that at Cassicaicum, we actually have the origin story of Augustine's biggest work, which is the exposition of the Psalms. At the direct midpoint, the dead center of Confessions, he hides something in there. And what he hides is the first exposition of the Psalms, the work that he would actually spend almost his entire life working on. And so this engagement with the Psalms, this engagement with Psalm 4 in particular, leads us to our closing thought on Cassicaicum, which is this. Embedded in Psalm 4 is actually in the first verse of Psalm 4. As Augustine's working through this, the psalm reads, "In my distress," this is the psalmist speaking, of course, "in my distress, you enlarged me. In my distress, you enlarged my heart." And so Augustine discovers something in Cassicaicum that I think feeds him for the rest of his life and gives him the energy and the perspective and the breadth of knowledge and the genius to produce the exposition of the Psalms, which is that he realizes that his engagement with the Psalms wasn't just an intellectual exercise. This enlarged his heart. This gave him a greater capacity. And so this puts us into contact with another fundamental idea of Augustine's spirituality, is that God is in the business of enlarging our hearts. And in the tribulations of life, he will crush our pride in order to make room for something. And what is it that he makes room for? There's a lot of things that immediately come to mind, but I think Augustine gives us the answer. Does God put us through tribulations or permit this to increase his gifts in us? Maybe. Does he do this to increase our faith? Yeah, I mean, that's not a wrong answer. That's a biblical answer for sure. Does he do it to increase our receptivity or capacity for grace? I think that's true too. But I think the Augustinian answer is, what does God enlarge our hearts for? God enlarges our hearts for himself. But this is the whole point. And I think this is arguable because at the very beginning of Book 1, Augustine makes a comment that's realized here in Book 9. He says, some of you might remember this, it's quite early in the beginning of Book 1, but he compares his soul to a house. Do you remember it? You remember this? He says, "Oh Lord, that you enter into my house, but like it's too narrow and it's kind of a mess and it's going to have features that are going to offend you." And that's basically what he says. But Augustine says this. He says, "The house of my soul is too small for you. It's too small for you to come into it. May it be enlarged by you." And none of you will be surprised, I think, to find that the same word that's used in the psalm, so it's dilatisti, which we get the word dilate from, you enlarge. He uses it like 2 or 3 times in all of Confessions. And it's here from Psalm 4, and it's at the beginning of Book 1. It says, "The house of my soul is too small for you. Enlarge it so that you can come in." And at Cassicaicum, that's what happens when he engages the Psalms. Augustine's heart is enlarged. So in wrapping up Cassicaicum, we've seen Augustine learns how to talk to God and about God beyond just the chattering that he had been doing leading up to this. He encounters the Psalms in a new way that enlarges his heart. And now he is prepared. He's prepared to formally transition from his old life to the new life in the waters of baptism. And so let's just move on to Augustine's very brief description of his baptism, and then we'll talk about Monica and then turn the corner towards the end. So we learned something interesting at the end of the conclusion, at the conclusion of the Cassicaicum retreat, which is that Augustine writes a letter. He writes a letter to Ambrose. Did you catch this? It's very brief. This doesn't take up a lot of space. Augustine writes a letter to Ambrose and expresses his intentions, which effectively is to come back to Milan and get baptized. And then he returns with Alypius and Adeodatus, and that's what happens. And then Ambrose responds to Augustine's letter. Now you might be thinking, well, those would be interesting to read. I guess we have the letters to Nebridia. Surely we have these. Well, in some bizarre twist of what is preserved and what's lost from antiquity, we don't have these letters. No, nobody's ever seen them. So we have zero actual correspondence. We have hundreds of letters of Augustine. We have letters between Augustine and Alypius, between various of his friends. But of all the letters, the letter that he sent to Ambrose and the letter that Ambrose sent to him has not survived. But we get the gist of it anyway. You get the sense maybe these were just a few lines. It was rather polite, maybe even to the point of being curt. Augustine writes and says, "This is my situation. I'm coming back to be baptized. Do you have any advice for me?" Ambrose writes back and says, "Well, my idea would be, why don't you read the book of Isaiah before you get baptized?" Which, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I read that, that's definitely not what anybody ever told me, and probably not something I would ever tell anyone else either. I mean, what would you say? Think about it. Somebody said, "All right, I'm preparing, in the catechumen," or they used to call it RCIA. That's apparently not apropos anymore. It's called OCIA or some such thing, but it doesn't matter. The point is, nobody tells you to read Isaiah. I mean, what do they say? Well, go read the Gospel of John, right? Of course, read the Gospel of John. Go read the Psalms. Nobody says go read the book of Isaiah. That generally would be counterproductive. And as it turned out, that was actually Augustine's experience. He picked it up and realized, no, I can't make heads or tails of this. I'm going to set this down until I'm better equipped to tackle a book like this. So if this question of why Ambrose would suggest Isaiah to Augustine interests you, believe it or don't, but there is an academic who wrote about a 30-page paper on why he thinks Ambrose told Augustine to read Isaiah. Interestingly, for all of the very careful logic in it, he never mentions that Ambrose was at the same time writing his commentary on Isaiah. So I guess be aware, if you ask a priest or bishop what you should read, he might tell you to read what he's actually working on in that moment. And that might be as far as it goes. In any event, Augustine returns to Milan and is baptized. I mean, I don't know how all of you feel about attending baptisms, but this is one I definitely would have liked to have seen. But thanks to the city of Milan's underground train project from 1960, we can get close. Okay, this is a very disorienting picture. I don't know how many times I looked at it before I realized the perspective of it. Can you see the arrow, by the way, on my screen? Okay, great. So when you're looking at this, you're like, okay, what's the perspective? Obviously, people are down below. So if you were to climb up the Duomo Cathedral of Milan about halfway, and it is absolutely ginormous, and stick your head out a window of the front of the cathedral and look down and take a picture, this is what you would have seen in 1960. Okay, if you were to do that today, you would just see a really nice kind of plaza area. You wouldn't have all of this nonsense. But in 1960, the city of Milan decided to expand the subway system, and they started excavating in front of the Duomo, and lo and behold, they found the baptistry. And so this is the original baptistry of, Ambrose had multiple churches in the city of Milan, but of one of the primary cathedrals. And this is a bird's eye view from the perspective of the cathedral, looking down in 1960. It's fascinating, not necessarily awe-inspiring. That's kind of awe-inspiring. So if you're ever in Milan or you ever take one of these Augustinian footstep tours, make sure you get the extra ticket that allows you to do the archaeological part of the Duomo, because all you have to do is walk down a stairway and voila, you are in the original baptistry and you are looking at the place that Ambrose, this is it, folks. This is where Ambrose baptized Augustine, Alypius, and Adeodatus. And here's a slightly different perspective. If you're brave enough to walk up, if you step over the cordon, go right up to the edge and take a picture. It looks like this. It's about, I don't know, like 5 feet deep or so. But yeah, this is there to be seen and touched and appreciated. So in any event, Augustine's relating of his baptism is pretty short and sweet. It's probably more notable for its location. It is the center of Book 9. Than its descriptiveness. It is rather nondescript. But it is in connection with baptism that we do learn that Adeodatus dies a short time later, a year or two later. And finally, in connection with baptism, and I don't think this is coincidental, that when Augustine relates details about his son in the Confessions, it's in connection with the fact that they were baptized together. So we learned that Adeodatus died shortly after. He was probably 17, 16, 17, 18. And then Augustine references another one of his works, this time by name. He didn't give us the name of any of the Cassicaicum dialogues. You probably caught that, but he tells us that basically says, I co-wrote a book with my son called The Teacher. And he actually says, if you want to see how clever this kid was, read the transcript of this philosophical dialogue called The Teacher, because everything that I wrote down is is the actual words that Adeodatus spoke. So we have a really remarkable document that is, frankly, I think a little bit understudied, which is we have a document that has the 16-year-old Adeodatus in dialogue with his father, and we get to hear his voice, according to Augustine, unedited and unfiltered. You don't find much like this in Latin literature or in ancient literature, so it's very interesting in its own right. So that's baptism and Adeodatus. And from this point, I think we can go ahead and move on to Monica and to the conclusion of Book 9. Okay, so we spent a lot of time on these other parts of Book 9 because, frankly, I find them fascinating, and I've been to some of these places, and it heightens, my own emotional involvement with the text. And I've, got some cool pictures from these places that I've been. But the other thing is that the portrait of Monica that's drawn in the second half of the book is rather transparent. Augustine's motive is rather clear here, and it's that he intends to convey in his confession and incidentally to the readership that Monica is a saint. She's not canonized at this point. Obviously, Augustine doesn't have the authority to do that. That sort of thought would never have occurred to him anyway. But this is the point. My mother is a saint. And again, you don't find anything in ancient literature, really don't find anything even in Christian literature up to this point, of a father lionizing his mother the way that Augustine is going to do here. So at 3.7.15, Augustine leaves behind his baptism, and he starts down this new track. He starts describing events in Milan in the year or so leading up to his baptism. But this, in actuality, is where he's going to start Monica's story for us. Because as he tells the story about the Empress, Valentinian's mother, who stormed the basilica and tried to take this from Ambrose for the Arian party. Monica's there. They're surrounded at night. The soldiers are there. I mean, the people in the church are thinking they might actually, the soldiers might knock down the door and kill everybody inside. This is not an improbable outcome. And Augustine describes Monica. Did you catch this? Augustine's not there. This is before his baptism. He's not there, but she is. And she's basically taking a leading role in supporting Ambrose and encouraging the people while they're under siege by the Roman army that's being directed by what Augustine considered kind of a mad woman who had kind of given herself over to the Arian heresy. So it's Monica that's in the basilica that's being stormed. It's Monica who's actually the eyewitness to the discovery of the bodies of Protasius and Gervasius. It's Monica who's the one who observes the fanfare and the miracles. Remember, she's the person who's at church twice a day. While Augustine is wrestling through his conversion, he's not at church except maybe on Sundays to hear Ambrose preach. He's not a part of these events. Monica is the one who's a part of these events, and she's probably relating the details to him. You've all seen this before. I've probably shown this twice. I guess that gives you a sense of the impression it made on me. Well, here it is the third time. This is not the same church. So the Duomo of Milan, where the baptistry is, dissociate that, disambiguate that. That's not the same. Ambrose had like 5 or 6 churches in Milan while he was the bishop. The one we looked at before is the big Duomo in the square next to the big shopping mall in modern Milan. That's where the baptistry is. This is the smaller Basilica of St. Ambrose, but this is where Protasius and Gervasius are actually buried. And so again, just the way that Book 9 comes alive, because all of these things still exist today. This is a period correct, 4th, 5th century mosaic. I mean, generally you would need to go over to Ravenna in Italy to see mosaics of this quality and this level of preservation. This is in Milan. Of course, you've seen this picture before as well, if you've been in an earlier session with us. But this is the complete skeletal remains of Ambrose with Protasius on his left and Gervasius on his right. So if you are at that mosaic and you walk about 50 feet, you take the stairs down, and like you're this, obviously there's glass there, but you're this close. I mean, Ambrose is still physically with us. And so these people literally jump out of the story Not a bad place to go read parts of Book 9 of the Confessions if you if you have the time or inclination. It makes it pretty real. So Monica is a part of all of this, and then Augustine pivots for a moment. And he says, well, then Evodius shows up on the scene, which is somebody who's a fellow North African. He had recently retired too, and he kind of swells this party of new converts who've abandoned government posts. And somehow it's through his inspiration that everybody decides, you know what, let's just go home. Let's just go back to North Africa. And so if you're in Milan to Rome and you need to get back to North Africa, at that time you would have, I think, just taken the river. Now it's about a 30-minute highway drive from Rome to Ostia. Like, it's that close. It's down by the airport. But basically, you took the boat from Rome down to Ostia, waited a day or two, and then took the boat from Ostia across to Carthage. So they get to Ostia. And then at 3:18, Augustine makes this very simple remark. He says, while we were at Ostia by the mouth of the Tiber, my mother died. Okay, and this is effectively the end of the biographical material in Confessions. Like at 3:18, when he says this, while we were at Ostia by the mouth of the Tiber, my mother died. This is the end. Like, this is the end of the biographical section, because the balance of Book 9 is all reminiscence and recollection about who Monica was. This is where Augustine tells her story. So let's do this to wrap up on Monica, and then I want to say something about the epilogue to the epilogue, which that'll make sense in just a minute. Let's take a quick survey of Monica's story as Augustine relates it and hone in on a couple of highlights. But first, speaking of things that we can still see, if you are ever in Rome, it's about a 30-minute drive down to Ostia. So there's the modern city of Ostia, and then just to the south of it is Ostia Antica. It used to sit right on the water, but because of the movement of silting and other geographical stuff I don't completely understand, the shore is actually like a mile or two from Ostia now, so it doesn't look like the way that it would have. But that's not the point for today. The point for today is this. This memorial plaque is, this would have been the wall of a small church inside of Ostia. We don't really know too much more about it. You can see up above here these people's heads. This is actually the theater. The theater is largely complete. Just incidentally, I would say Ostia is pretty remarkably well preserved. I mean, Ostia is not the first place people think of going to see Roman ruins, but it's crazy how intact some of this stuff is. The point, however, is there is this very nice memorial to Sancta Monica, Saint Monica, and this is just a kind of a quick summary of what we see in Book 9 from the Confessions. If you walk a mile or two to the north, you will find another little church, which is actually where Monica was buried. And so I think I told the story before, but World War II-ish period, 1940s, a couple kids were in the churchyard of St. Aurea, which is not in ancient Ostia. It's actually located in what is now modern Ostia. But the point is, they're playing soccer. This kid kicks the ball and stubs his toe. He's like, oh man, what'd you run into? And they pull this out of the ground. And so this is basically a third of the grave marker for Monica. And so this is well documented. There's about 10 different manuscripts that reference this. I mean, the history of this piece is known quite well. It's about 100 years later, someone who was maybe bishop in Ostia went to Monica's tomb and had this put up. It normally would be like, you can't see because of my hands, but it'd be like 3 feet wide. And we've got about a foot of it. We talked about this once before, so I'm not going to belabor it, but this is something that you can go see, and you can stand. I mean, you can stand in the little church court. There's nobody there. I mean, it's like an empty little church. I mean, you can stand where Monica was buried, and basically soak that in. Should you then make your way back up to Rome, if you go to the Church of St. Augustine in Rome, which is, as I understand it, like basically the world headquarters for the Augustinian order, this is sitting in one of the rooms there. So this is the actual sarcophagus that Monica was buried in that they brought back from Ostia. So this is there to see. I'm not sure whether the lid is original, but this section here, the lid may be later and the bottom, maybe the feet may be later, but this middle section is definitely original. So that's in Rome to see as well. Okay, so let's take a quick survey of what Augustine says about Monica's life and touch a few highlights, and then we'll wrap up. See if there's a minute or two for questions. Well, as we've already seen in this chapter, Monica has already been depicted heroically in the role that she played in the siege of Ambrose's cathedral. She's present, she's brave, she's encouraging others, she's risking her life with the bishop. But then Augustine basically gives a mini confession, which kind of mirrors his own in some ways, of the life of Monica, takes her through various stages of life. And this is what we see. So the survey goes like this. We know that she was heroic at the end, but in Augustine's description of her, we see that as a child, Monica was raised by a religious, though probably rather severe old woman who managed to inculcate virtue and the fear of the Lord in Monica. So there's this this initial formation that she has. Monica then has a conversion experience. We talked about this a couple times, where an inadvertent word comes to her. The person speaking it doesn't intend it to have this effect. And in fact, the person speaking it might be doing it to us. But this is the incident with the wine, right? Monica, the parents say, "Hey, Monica, go down and just bring us a glass of wine, bring us a goblet of wine." She does this. This kind of becomes her job. She takes a little dab of it and kind of crunches up her nose and says, "Well, I don't really like this." But then eventually she does kind of like it. And then eventually, as time passes, who knows, maybe she's 10, 11, 12 years old. Now she's basically downing a goblet every time she gets down to the wine cellar. And one of the other maidservants picks up on this, and for reasons we don't completely know or understand, basically lands this huge insult on Monica while they're alone. And the way that I translated this, it's a funny Latin word. But the servant, the slave, basically said to Monica, you are a little lush. I mean, that's basically what she said. You're a little drunk. And Monica, this is the servant. Monica is the daughter of the household. Like, this could have gone very badly for the servant. But it's interesting because Augustine says, despite the malice of the servant girl, this was a conversion. This was a moment of conversion for Monica. And she was cured of this. You remember, we saw the same thing with Alypius, right? Alypius is in class, and Augustine makes this about the circus, and then Alypius is like, "Oh, well, I'm never doing that again." And so we have that with Alypius. We have, of course, Tolle Lege with Augustine, and now we have the little lush comment for Monica. But it's an inflection point. It's a conversion point. Then we see Monica as a wife, and as a wife, she's faithful and shrewd. And then we see Monica as a daughter, and she's dutiful to her parents. And we see Monica as daughter-in-law, and she's winsome to her mother-in-law. And we see Monica as friend. She's a confidant. She's a counselor. She's a peacemaker. We see Monica as a servant to the servants of God, which Augustine colors this in from Cassiciacum. He said Monica, she's the matriarch. She's the mother, but she acts like she's the sister. Like, she acts like she's here to serve us. She's the matriarch, but she behaves like she's the little sister. This is, of course, entirely complementary. But Monica is the servant to the servants of God. Monica is a conversation partner. This is implicit in Cassiciacum, at least in Confessions, but it's explicit here. And of singular importance to us, Monica is a co-mystic with Augustine. And let me jump to this for a moment. So this is a relatively famous painting. If you do any Google search about Augustine or Monica, this comes up pretty quickly. This is the scene of Monica and Augustine having this simultaneous mystical experience, which interestingly, in the history of Christian mysticism, and there's an endless amount of books on this, this is the only instance in the entire history of Christian mysticism where two people claim to have a concurrent mystical experience. Mystical experiences are always solo trips. This is the nature of mysticism, where people don't have mystical experiences together. And so the crazy thing about this, why it gets such an enormous amount of study, is this is the only time that it happens. This is the only time it's attested in Christian literature where two people say that simultaneously they had the same momentary glimpse of beatific vision, which we think from reading this, maybe this lasted a second or two. It definitely was not a sustained experience. So let's go ahead and move on from here so that we have at least a minute or two for questions. I think that sufficiently covers Monica and leads us to the critical point. Oh, wait. One more picture. Remember where this takes place. This looks real airy, like this looks like they're on the top of a hotel overlooking the Mediterranean. I don't know what's going on here. It's effective, right? But it's not really period correct, because what Augustine says is that they're in the second story
Hmm.
of a house or an apartment building overlooking a garden.
Hey,
Oh,
Kevin, the picture didn't advance.
oh, are you still looking at?
We're still looking at Augustine and Monica.
Oh no, that's good. Yeah, that's wait.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Never
sorry.
mind.
Here comes the punchline. Okay,
Okay.
so this is not how it's described. This is how it's described. So this is actually in Ostia. I don't know. I mean, there's so many buildings. There's so many things that haven't been excavated fully. But if you want to use your historical imagination and wander around Ostia for a while, this is the residential section of Ostia. I'm not making this up. This isn't like a barn or something. These were residences. This is a second story window overlooking a garden. Am I saying this is where Monica and Augustine had the experience? No, of course not. I mean, there could be a dozen of these, but this is the picture that should come to mind: a second story window of a friend's house overlooking a garden. Of course, this is the ruins of it. It would have been palatial and beautiful and looked like something that fell out of the Ritz-Carlton, but this is what it looks like today. So let me say this epilogue to the epilogue. I'll explain what I mean and then have a minute or so for questions. What do I mean by epilogue to the epilogue? Well, like I said, book 9, as far as I'm concerned, is the epilogue to the biographical section of Confessions. Monica's life, her earthly life, ends in 387, but Augustine's doesn't. And so when we get to the beginning of book 10, next month when we get together, Augustine just keeps right on trucking, and he gives no indication that anything had happened since the end of book 9. And effectively, book 9 ends at 9817, where he says, and we went to Austin and my mother died. And then we get to book 10, and we're like, whoa, wait, well, wait a second, what happened? Now you're the bishop in Hippo. So I got to tell you what happened, because we won't have time to do it in book 10, because book 10 is the longest book in the Confessions by a lot. And so we're going to need all our time to do book 10. So let me give you the rundown here. The epilogue to the epilogue is this. What happens after the end of book 9? After Monica's death, almost immediately, there was really serious political unrest in the Western Empire that actually delayed the Milan friend group from returning home. And so Augustine actually, he's not exactly stranded, but he takes another year in Rome. So when the insurrection was quelled over the summer of the next year, they executed the guy that was causing all the problems. Augustine sails home in the fall of 388, goes home to Tagaste. Apparently, I mean, the family home is his now. Patricius is gone, Monica's gone, he inherits it. Apparently, he converts the family estate into some sort of monastic community with some of these friends who have come back with him from Milan, and just starts cranking out written works. We have all of these. Most of them are anti-Manichaean. And while he's doing this, he's got exactly what he had envisioned, right? In book 6, a monastic community committed to serious discussion and theological inquiry, addressing the problem of Manichaeism in an incredibly intelligent way, and making sure that he avoids churches that are looking for a bishop, because in late antiquity, you could be rather forcibly thrust into this role. Well, in 391, he gets a letter from a guy up in Hippo who says, hey, I don't know, maybe I'm going to come down and join you guys. I might get in on this kind of quasi-monastic community thing. And Augustine says, all right, I'm going to come up to Hippo and visit you. So he goes up to Hippo. He thinks, all right, I'll meet up with this guy and recruit him. So they, who knows, they have lunch or coffee or whatever they did then. And then decides, all right, I'm going to go to church. It's safe. There's no bishop. And then walks in the door, and Bishop Valerius on that day happens to give a sermon about how he needs a new priest. And everybody in the congregation turns and looks at Augustine and says, that's the guy. And these North Africans, kind of hot-tempered, they literally grab him and rush him up to the front to Valerius, and Augustine just breaks down in tears. Now, some people thought he broke down in tears because they were only making him a priest, and he acknowledges this, but he says, yeah, that's not it at all. No, you don't understand. I do not want this job. I'm not crying because I didn't get the higher office. Like, I'm crying because my monastic paradise is over. And he had some idea of what was coming. So he gets careless, he gets seized. As John Quinn wrote, who incidentally, in my opinion, like one of the best books, most unknown books anybody's ever seen on the Confessions. I know that it's inversed on the screen, but A Companion to the Confessions of St. Augustine by John Quinn. He was an Augustinian, like far and away. It's like finding a lost record of Bob Dylan and being like, how did nobody ever hear this? Like, this is amazing stuff. And it's, if you want the book to read after this as your companion to Confessions, get Quinn's Companion. In any event, he wrote this. He said, a coincidence describing this event. A coincidence was turned into a God incident, fulfilling Monica's prayers beyond her wildest dreams. So in 395, this happens in 391. In 395, he's named co-bishop, which wasn't exactly canon law at the time, but people went with it. And then in 396, Valerius dies, and Augustine takes the reins, and he's the successor. Now he's the bishop of Hippo. That's how he gets to Hippo from Tagaste, going to recruit somebody from the monastery. That's why we refer to him as Augustine, bishop of Hippo. 396, the last thing I'll say is this. He becomes bishop in 396. Simplicianus, do you remember him? He's old, but he's good, right? Ambrose's successor. Well, Simplicianus finds out Ambrose is Augustine's bishop, and he writes him this letter, and he says, I think we need to have a conversation about grace and about how Paul talks about grace. And so Augustine, in response to Simplicianus's request, has this immersive rereading of Paul, but particularly the letter to the Romans, and realizes the dominant role of divine grace in human salvation. And this, people think, I like the idea, this is kind of the awakening to the dominant role of divine grace that is sitting behind Augustine writing the Confessions, because that's the point of the Confessions, right? Every one of these little instances in life is turning him and leading him to a fuller expression, a fuller experience of the grace of God. So I went a couple minutes over. I apologize for that, but we'll stop there, and then we'll put us in a good position to be prepared for book 10.
Thanks, Kevin. That was awesome, as always. And we have some time for questions. Well, we're over time, but if there are questions, fire away.
Nico says, I deeply appreciate this passage as an aphorism after Monica was rebuked for her drinking. Just as flattering friends corrupt, so quarrelsome enemies often bring us correction. Oh, that's excellent. Where is that aphorism from? That sounds like proverbial or like wisdom literature. So Nikos, if you want to comment on that.
I think he just wrote it himself, but I kind of took it as an aphorism, actually.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, agree. Otherwise, it doesn't look like anyone jotted anything down.
Well, we have the chat room that remains open, and Kevin is attentive to it. Thank you, Kevin. And so if there are questions that come up in between now and our next session, please fire away. Please keep reading. You know, I know I'll be, just perfectly transparent. I had not read the Confessions until this series. And so now, having read it and having the opportunity to go back and revisit it through Kevin's lectures has been enormously helpful. So, encourage everybody to do that to the extent that I guess I'd say remain current in the readings. Please pass this on to others who may be interested. Please also, as Kevin was awesome in promoting that we do have merch. So there's Augustinian hats and T-shirts on the National Shrine of St. Rita website. For those who may be inclined, the National Shrine of St. Rita offers really terrific day pilgrimages. Would encourage everybody to visit. St. Rita, of course, is next to Augustine and Monica. Probably the Augustinian saint that we hold on to the tightest. And it's a beautiful church and shrine for her in Philly. And I look forward to seeing you all in another month. And so, Kevin, thank you. Sarah, thank you. All of you for joining, thank you. God bless you all, and have a peaceful rest of the evening. Good night.